Amud Yomi, Tractate Niddah, 50b. And it starts a new idea at the last line of 50a, which is Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Yochanan, Olshin Shizaran Mitchila Lebehema Venimnach Alehem Yodam. Rabba Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says in the case of endives that were initially planted to be fed to animals, and later the owner reconsidered their designation and decided to use them for human consumption. Okay, now we're on 50b, top of the page. Tzrichos machshave echeshiyetarshu kasava machsheves chibu lo yishme machshave. They require intent to be used for human consumption once they are detached from the ground in order for them to be susceptible to ritual impurity. Rabbi Yochanan rules in this manner because he holds that intent to designate produce while it is attached to the ground is not considered intent. Okay. Al machsheves chahim lo yishma machshava. Hachanami machsheves chibo lo yishma machshava. Rava said, we learned in the Mishnah in Taharot 1:1 as well. 13 matters were stated with regard to the carcass of a kosher bird, and this is one of them. In order for such a carcass to be susceptible to impurity and to be capable of imparting impurity to food through contact, it renders a person's intention to eat it. But it does not require exposure to liquid to be rendered susceptible to impurity. Even if one had intent to eat the bird while it was still alive, not while it's alive, but he had the intent while the bird was alive, but not to eat it when it's alive. Okay. It can be misleading. Intent is still required after it because it became a carcass for it to transmit impurity. Rava concludes, evidently, intent that the bird be eaten while the bird is alive is not considered intent. Here too, intent to designate produce while it is attached to the ground is not considered intent. Rabbi Zera Amar, Hacha begoizer shenafa min harus askinan, de lo havi kaman l'chashor. Rabbi Zera said, Rava's proof is inconclusive as here we are dealing with a young bird that fell from a height where the bird was not before us prior to it becoming a carcass, so that one could have had intent that it is food. Consequently, it requires intent afterward for it to impart impurity, but had there been intent while it was still alive, that would have sufficed. Amarle Abaye Tanagoilis Shibiyavne Ma'ikale Memao Amarle Tanagol Bahava. Abaye said to Rabbi Zera, what is there to say about the case of the chicken in Yavne? In that instance, the sages deemed the chicken impure due to intent only after it becomes a carcass, despite the fact that it was present before them while it was alive. This apparently indicates that intent which occurred while the bird was alive is not considered intent. Rabbi Zera said to Abayi, that was actually a wild chicken which was not before them while it was alive, and therefore there was no intent that it should be food while it was alive. Achichu alei tarnagoil v'ha'oif tamehu v'yav tamemi kam tamei amalahu Abayi gav rabba mar milsa lo itechichu alei b'tarnagoil shemordo umay borod ibarem mimah. Those who heard this comment laughed at Rabbi Zera's interpretation. A wild chicken is a non-kosher bird, and does a non-kosher bird impart impurity? Abaye said to them, a great man has stated a matter. Do not laugh at him. Rabbi Zera means that this is referring to a chicken that rebelled against its owner, ran away to the wild, and raised its kosher chicks there. One of those chicks subsequently returned from the wild. Consequently, it had not been present before the sages while it was alive. And what did Rabbi Zera mean when he mentioned a wild chicken? He meant one that was created from a chicken that rebelled. Rav Papa Amar Tarnigolta Diagame Hamar Rav Papa Tame Rav Papa Tarnigola Diagma Sir Tarnigola Diagma Sharia. Rav Papa stated in an alternative interpretation, it was a marsh, the Agma, it was a marsh hen. Since no one lives in a marsh, there was no opportunity for intent while it was alive, and therefore intent was necessary afterward. The Gemara adds, Rav Papa conforms to his standard line of reasoning in this regard. As Rav Papa said, the animal called the marsh rooster is prohibited, as it is a non-kosher bird, whereas the marsh hen is kosher and is permitted. V'simonech amoini velo amonis. Dosh mereimal tarnigol to the agmasira chazuya Rabbanan Niddah sevach hainu gerusa. And you're mnemonic to remember which animal is permitted and which is prohibited is the well-known statement of the sages with regard to the verse, an Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, Deuteronomy 23 verse 4. An Ammonite man is unfit to enter the assembly, but not an Ammonite woman. Here too, the animal with a female name is permitted, whereas the one with a male name is prohibited. Interesting. Tarnagolta or Tarnagola? Tarnagolta is kosher, Tarnagola is not kosher. Yeah. Interesting. Murray Martat, the Martian is prohibited. Contrary to the opinion of Rav Papa, the sages saw that it mauled and ate its prey. And this is the Geruta, a non-kosher bird. Tanu Rabbanan goizu shnofa lagas v'chi shavarav lahalois lekusi tamei kelev toya Rav Yochanan ben Nuri omer av lekelev tamei. Apropos, the case of a young kosher bird fell and died. The sages taught in bright a young kosher bird that fell into a wine press and died there, where the owner intended to draw it up from the press for a Samaritan to eat, is ritually impure, like any carcass of a kosher bird. If you intended to draw it up from the press for a dog to eat, it is ritually pure. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nui says, for Samaritans, it's ritually impure, but for a dog, it's pure. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, even if he intended to draw it up from the press for a dog to eat, it is impure, as the bird does not require intent for it to be impure. Amud Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, kal v'chomer, hi mitame tuma v'chamura, shelo b'machshove, lo yitame tuma, kala shelo b'machshava. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, in explanation of his opinion, this halacha can be derived by the following a fortiori inference: if the carcass of a kosher bird transmits severe ritual impurity, meaning it renders one's garments impure when an olive bulk of it is in the throat without thought, meaning even if no one had intent for that person that person should eat it, should it not transmit a lenient impurity of food by touch alone, likewise without thought? Amar lo, Amar lo, Amar lo, Amar lo. Lo, אם אמר בתרומה חמורה, שכן אינו יורדס לכך. תאמר בתרומה קלה, שכן יורדס לכך. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, no, this is not a valid Kal v'chomer. It's not a valid a fortiori inference. If you said that there is no requirement of intent with regard to severe ritual impurity, That is because the severe ritual impurity does not assume its status with that requirement of thought, meaning intent is not relevant to that type of impurity. Shall you also say that there is no requirement of thought with regard to lenient impurity, which does assume its status with that requirement of thought? Gemara will soon explain the precise meaning of this concept of assuming its status with the requirement of thought. Amar lehen tarni goles shebiyable tochiach shiyaredes l'kaf b'timuha shelo b'machshava amar lo misham raya kusim hayosham v'chish v'alea l'achila. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said to the rabbis, it's the case of the chicken, and Yavne can prove that the question of whether or not intent is required does not depend on that factor. The case in Yavne involved an item that does assume its status with the requirement of thought, and the sages declared it in part with that intent. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, will you cite a proof from there? In that case, there were Samaritans there, and the people in Yavne intended that it be eaten by the Samaritans. But Ma'eskinon, lama la machshava v'tzanan nevilas b'him v'toira b'chol mokol b'nim v'toif to'el chayle b'kaki ein tzarich la machshava la yachshel. The Gemara analyzes the case of a young bird that fell into a wine press. What type of situation are we dealing with? If we say we're dealing with cities where there are many people available to consume all sorts of food, including the carcass of a kosher bird, why does it require intent? But if we learn in the Mishnah in Oktzin 3.3 that an unslaughtered, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah in Oktzin 3.3 that unslaughtered carcass of a kosher animal in any location, whether the population be large or small, and the carcass of a kosher bird or the fat of a kosher animal found in cities, required neither intent for human consumption nor contact with liquid for them to be rendered susceptible to impurity? Rather, it must be referring to villages where the population is small and there are not as many people who would eat the carcass. But this too is difficult. Is there anyone who said that intent is not required in the case of a carcass of a non-kosher bird for the impurity of food? Didn't we learn the beginning of that same Mishnah? Carcass of a non-kosher bird, of a non-kosher animal found at any location, and an unslaughtered carcass of a kosher bird in the villages both require intent to consume them, but they do not require contact with a liquid to become susceptible to ritual impurity. Zera Bar Chanina says, actually the bride is referring to a case that occurred in the city, and even so, intent is required. The reason is that the young bird fell into a wine press, and the wine press rendered it disgusting, and thereby rendered it like a carcass of a kosher bird in the village where there are a few people who would eat it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri kalam chleimil im etamatuma chamura shlama b'machshava etamatuma kala shloi b'machshava. The Gemara analyzes the exchanges cited above. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that this halacha can be derived by an authoritarian prince if the carcass of a kosher bird transmits ritual impurity, severe ritual impurity, without thought. Would it not transmit lenient impurity without thought? Amar lo, amru lo, lo. The rabbi says to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, no, this is not a valid kal v'chomer. If you said so with regard to severe ritual impurity, that is because it does not assume its status with that requirement of thought. Lo. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the clause? It does not assume its status with that requirement of thought. In what manner is thought required for the lenient impurity of food? It imparts in the case of a bird carcass, but not required for the severe impurity. It imparts when it is in the throat. Rabbi said that this is what the rabbi said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. No, if you said that there is no requirement of thought,